Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Cloud Masters. I'm your host, Matan Bordeaux, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sam Clark. And today we're going to talk about cloud migrations, specifically AWS migrations, and specifically their MAP program, which we'll learn more about from our two guests, Fabian Lober and Piyush Patil. They are two senior cloud architects at DoiT, and doing a lot of work around migration. So I thought to have them on here to tell us more about the MAP program from AWS and some pitfalls they see customers making at every phase. Welcome, Fabian, Piyush. Maybe can one of you start us off? Just take us through what is MAP, what stages, how do you qualify for MAP?
I think MAP is a program which you can look from different sides perspectives, but in a nutshell, it is a funding program framework from AWS, which will help you to get through the migration, be successful in the migration, and have an outcome at the end, which sets you up for success. And this combined with the financial aspect to offset this migration bubble you will always have when you shift from left to right, you have to run your processes parallel, and the funding is there to offset this and make a good case out of it.
So that's first point. MAP is, a lot of people think of MAP as just funding, but you're saying it's not just funding.
I would even go so far and say it's more a framework than funding, but for sure the funding is nice to have.
When I work with a lot of customers, I find that they are either very unaware of MAP or very unaware of the benefits they can get from properly analyzing their migration plans. So, Piyush, what do you see as the important stages of the MAP setup?
Yeah, so basically this map was designed around three main phases. The first phase is known as the access phase. Second one is the mobilize phase, and third one is migrate and modernize phase. So access phase, this phase helps us to identify what the migration is happening from. Let's say if it is happening from an on-premise data center to AWS, or if some other cloud provider to AWS, and based on that assessment, like that is what is assessed in this phase by the cloud architects or solution architects involved into uh, this program attached to the customer. Basically, capacity planning is the main backbone of this phase. We need to know what current capacity the customer has and what current capacities we are going to need into AWS. And then there is like a full-fledged calculation of annual recurring revenue that is going to get attached after this migration is completed by the customer. We call that total cost of ownership. That total cost of ownership is totally calculated by the capacities that those are decided for this whole migration to happen. So this access phase, I will say first what we do is we take an inventory of the complete migration that needs to happen to AWS. Second one, we need to create a architecture diagram, like how the whole application is going to look in AWS, so that we have a set list of AWS services that are going to be utilized by the customer into AWS. Once that architecture diagram is completed, then we go towards capacity. Many times customers mistake, like if they are using certain type of server into their on-premise data center, they just need the similar equivalent of that server in AWS. Those are kind of mistakes that I had seen many customers doing, because on-premise services are they work totally different when it comes to capacity. So there has to be good amount of load testing and performance testing done by the customer to select the correct capacity in AWS. This is where the solution architects involved from the AWS side or DoiT side come into picture, where they will be able to help the customer on selecting the correct capacities for the migration.
But even like after assess, so assess, and by the way, MAP is Migration Acceleration Program. I didn't call it by the full name in the beginning. But from what I understand, you're basically translating your infrastructure today, whether on another cloud or on premise, and you're putting it in the language of AWS technology. We have this set up on premise. What does this look like in EC2 or other services, et cetera, et cetera? And so it's almost like this translation, this capacity planning. It's like the flip side of the coin is that TCO calculations. This is what this translates into in AWS, and this is how much we think it's going to cost us on I don't know, it's TCO on a monthly basis, on a
Yeah. So
AR.
TCO usually gives a annual cost that is going to be for this, and TCO is the base for the whole map, because after you calculate the TCO, map percentage of funding is going to get calculated. So asset phase is like the main backbone of this whole migration acceleration program.
Yeah, let's wrap up with what goes on under Mobilize and Migrate, and then maybe before we go into maybe some of the pitfalls you see on each the mistakes you see being made at each stage, let's also talk about who can qualify for this for MAP.
I can go for the Mobilize, but I wanted to add something more to the assess phase, just briefly. First of all, for everyone who's wondering, TCO stands for total cost of ownership. You're surprised how many people don't know this and are wondering. And the second one, it's basically a gap analyzed between the current state and the possible future state, as Piyush said. And then it's not limited to the technical part only. It's also going into the business and people part. So assessing the state of the people, how fit are they, what they need for being able to execute the migration and so on. And this is initially only a high-level overview because you can't go so deep as you need in the initial phase. So you're iterating over this, then the Mobilize phase, where we look more detailed into the assessment data, so servers, target architecture, migration readiness assessment, and so on. And in parallel, you start building up your readiness, your environment, like a landing zone. You're going into each of the workloads. You're looking into the workloads. What do I need to do? What are the stakeholders? What is the migration scenario? How the target actually looks like, and so on. Building up the operating and security model, so runbooks, playbooks, whatever you need on the security side. And then you have the, let's say, people change, the culture change, the skill training, analysis, and so on.
Now, who qualifies for MAP? Is it something that anyone can qualify for? Is it just if your TCO is this much and that's it, you qualify? Or
so now it gets complicated, but we can say it quite easily. Basically, everyone qualifies for MAP itself, but they maybe don't qualify for funding or the overall funding. The funding case aside, typically everything is valid which is existing and then migrated to AWS or modernized in AWS itself. So it's called migration. So what you plan to do must exist already somewhere.
So we can use this for moving something out of another cloud provider or from on-premise, but it's not a development slush fund for a new workload that we just started thinking of last week.
So the one mistake I've seen customers making is, let's say they are migrating their EC2 instance type from one to another. They think it is going to be approved for a map. That does not qualify for map. It has to be a net new workload or modernization of the stack. Let's say they want to modernize from EC2 to EKS or Kubernetes or more containerized. That might qualify for map, but not changing just your resources types inside your application. It does not qualify for map. So that is one mistake we are seeing customers doing, coming to us saying, okay, it is going to increase our cost, and does this qualify for map? But that does not qualify for map.
Right, but a re-architecture within AWS is something that I think probably a lot of people don't think of. I certainly don't. I often think of if a customer is moving from Azure, from on-prem, as the primary use case.
it seems like to me that if you get the TCO wrong or the capacity planning steps wrong, that it's sort of like it's like a crumbling foundation that your migration is built upon. So I feel like it's important. Maybe we can discuss some of the mistakes you see in those, specifically with those steps in the assess. Wrong, like maybe you do an incorrect mapping of your on-prem to AWS, so on and so forth. So maybe you guys can talk, Fabian, talk more specifically to that maybe.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm pretty sure Piyush has some more things to add. Basically, everything falls and grows with the accuracy of the data you're collecting on-prem. So if you're going to your, I don't know, printed out inventory sheet and just taking the servers from there handwritten, then it's probably very inaccurate and your TCO is way off from what it should be. If you then add more data sources, better quality to the TCO gets better, and also your forecasting gets better. And a too high TCO has an impact on the business decision itself. So maybe that's the reason why you don't want to migrate, you don't see the return of investment on this, and then it is decided against it. Or you're calculating too low, so your budget is not fitting. And for sure, all of this has as well an impact on the possible funding you can get, or you're eligible for, or maybe not eligible for.
Once one I want to add is, once a TCO is approved and a map is approved, the percentage of funding is based on the TCO calculation. So you have to be like double sure. You need to run the whole calculation to some specialized architect, because once the map terms are approved, you cannot change that in future. So let's say you under calculate and your TCO at the end of the year is like double something. You are only going to get whatever is attached to your map funding thing. It cannot be changed in the future. So that's why we always tell customer like TCO is the main part, and the capacity you are planning, that is the main part for this whole map to be successful.
But on that point, Piyush, AWS are reviewing the assess phase as well, right? So this is not a case where I can just come up with a little WordPress server that I want to migrate and say that it's going to cost $12 million, right? It's something where we're reviewing this properly and making sure that we are in a realistic state. And at the end of the day, I think as Fabian said, the percentages that are being covered by AWS, it's not ever anywhere near 100%, right? So if you get it wrong, or if you massively oversize things or anything like that, you're going to end up paying more yourself. So you really need to just make sure you're getting that stuff right.
From my point of view, the experience, overestimating is from the technical part better, maybe not for the decision making. You can always reduce your instance sizes, or you learn with new metrics, or you save at the end, in quotes, some money there. Instead of the other way around, when you have suddenly higher costs, the happiness on the customer side is not so good, because then some people need to explain why it's more costly than initially planned. So overestimating is at least slightly, most of the time, the better choice.
Moving a little bit away from the costing piece, when we're talking about the assess phase, are there? You already mentioned, Fabian, there are a few things like landing zones and so on that customers might need to build. Are there other things? Actually, I think that was Piyush that mentioned that. Are there other things that that you see customers forgetting to, or not being aware that they need to worry about?
You said assess, but you're meaning Mobilize, huh?
I did, yes.
Yeah.
Or have you
No,
put
you're
now
right,
the
yeah.
landing zone into the assess phase?
Well, I mean, we were talking more about assessment TCO, but building a landing zone is definitely much more Mobilize, of course.
But that's a good point. People are mixing up what to do in which phase and when to start something. I've seen companies building up landing zones immediately after the first idea of running it, something in AWS, also as part of a migration. And there's no really benefit of doing this except that you pay for it, which is not a benefit. So taking the right decision at the right time is really important. Some are dependent, some can run parallel. So starting with advocating and teaching quite early is beneficial, because then you have more manpower, more resources to support, to understand it, to drive business value, and not only execute something, also think internally about the migration and so on.
Do you ever deal with customers, or do you experience customers having a wrong perception of what this is going to require? How long it's going to take, the effort on their side?
For how long, I will add to this. For how long it is going to take, customers many times think this is something they can do their own. So there is no any project management involved here. They are just going to launch servers and start migrating. But there is definitely a project management part to this, because only good project managers can forecast like how much time this whole migration process is going to take. If you try to do it yourself, you might tell AWS, oh, we will be done in 3 months. But we have seen cases where for 2 years the migrations are going on, because they thought this was just like a click of some buttons and launching some its services inside AWS and putting the data and everything is going to run. So that is one mistake I had seen. Like you need a proper project management around this, and second one is you need correct SMEs to guide you in this whole process. Please do not try to. We always tell customers, do not try to do it yourself, like a cowboy or something like that.
But even
Yeah.
when working with a partner, many customers are underestimating what they need to do on their own and how it may slow down. Because it's basically just in server and quote to migrate, well, that's initial thinking, but then you have an application running on it. Then you have maybe a third-party stakeholder in it who is maintaining the application. And you have business units, application users, stakeholders in it. So the overhead of bringing all of this together, communicating, adjusting, planning, executing, testing, also when working with a partner or a hands-on partner is quite large on the customer side, and it can slow down a lot, in particular when these applications are interconnected in between the company. So maybe you can't migrate application A without migrating application B or other dependency, which I also quite often forget about.
I think one of the most common things I see, I've had a couple of customers that have moved from one major cloud provider to another, and they always underestimate the effort required. And sometimes it's just from they've believed the hype on Kubernetes, and oh, it's all in Kubernetes. Obviously, we can just move it tomorrow, and that's just simply not the case. But I did have a customer about 3 years ago here where they said, "Oh no, we're going to move everything from Google to AWS or vice versa." I can't remember which way they went. And after 2 years, they were still going on that migration, which was meant to take them 3 months. So, you really do need to make sure, as you mentioned there, Piyush, that you do have a good product management strategy in place, and a project management strategy, and that you drive that home, because if you lose focus halfway through or anything else goes wrong, then you'll be dealing with the tech debt or whatever it is for months or years to come.
Don't forget the parallel cost, for example, as well. In particular, if you buy servers or lease servers or have a co-location managed space somewhere, and you have the AWS cost on the side, and you run parallel, maybe stuffing as well.
And one main thing I forgot to mention, AWS always makes sure the architecture the customer is building on AWS is in line with their well-architected framework. So customer needs to make sure, like all the six pillars of well-architected framework. You can see online, you will find all the pillars, but security is the main pillar which customer forget even in the calculation. If they don't calculate the security services that are needed, like many times they miss those security services. Like they just, let's say they're migrating some servers from on-premise to EC to AWS. They will just calculate the servers needed, but they will not calculate all the services to monitor, like CloudWatch or Security Hub, etc. So those kind of costs needs to be calculated also in the TCO, because that is going to be a part of your whole migration.
That's a really good point, because it's quite tough to calculate these services for something you have to migrate.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why do you feel that security is overlooked?
Many times customers are missing the CISO in their team. Like they think the CISO does not needs to be involved in this whole migration. So we have mentioned from time to time, bring all the stakeholders of your company together. Do not try to do it only using the infrastructure team. You need the security team also involved to see how they are going to monitor this whole thing in cloud.
I think that's 99% of the cases. 99% of the cases.
Yeah,
makes sense. And I imagine also, like, it's different effort, different things you need to plan for, depending on if you're moving from on-prem to cloud, from cloud, one cloud provider to another cloud provider. I imagine that the considerations also change there. Data center versus SaaS, things like that.
It's basically a completely different approach depending on the source where you're coming from. I would state that the data center lift and shift migration is the easiest in all points, because it's very clear to plan, very clear to calculate. It then gets complicated when you either plan directly to do a modernization of all of this, or you migrate an existing SaaS application, maybe even from another cloud provider to AWS. And then you need to start matching the services, calculating the differences. You have some kind of scaling factor in this, or maybe per user, per device, something like this. So you need to get all of this into a realistic calculation, and breaking it down to a single cost item is most of them the most effective, because then you know your per item cost and you can translate it to traffic or security costs, which are related on the amount of whatever you run there.
You're talking my FinOps language now, Fabian. I love it. But in my experience, I agree with you completely that a lift and shift is conceptually the easiest. Architecturally, it's the simplest for everybody to understand as they're doing it. We had a database server with 16 processors and however many terabytes of RAM on-prem. Let's do the same in the cloud. In my experience, that's also the most likely to fail or to cause a bad cloud project. And we see there are a number of companies out there on LinkedIn posting how they moved to the cloud and then they moved back because it was rubbish and it failed and it was no good for them. And I think in every one of those I've ever read, the story was, we moved from using a bunch of VMs in our data center to using a bunch of VMs in the cloud. We didn't optimize anything along the way, and we ended up spending a lot more money. And then they're surprised about it, right? So are there any easy ways to modernize as you're doing that migration rather than doing a straight lift and shift?
Easy way, I will say, it depends on your team skill set. First, let's little bit take a backtrack for the lift and shift. Lift and shift is the most favorite migration strategy for all cloud providers, because it is going to cost you definitely more than your on-premise data center. But cloud was not built to just replicate your on-premise data center to public cloud. It was built for cost effective, running your application cost effectively. So the skill set of your team is definitely very important here. And if the teams are not that skilled, including partners like DoiT is more important, because the engineers and cloud architects at DoiT will definitely help you and the good strategy to cost effectively migrate to public cloud. They will not come to you and say, okay, just do a lift and shift and call it a day. They are definitely going to guide you and say, okay, this is definitely going to cost you more. And if you migrate from a EC2 to a containerized application or a serverless application, that is going to cost you less on public cloud. Or if you are 90% going to get into that area where you will say, oh, we wanted to reduce our cost, but our cost is now like 4 or 5 times more. So including, if you don't have the skill set, including partners like DoiT is very much important in this field, because we specialize in that. Like DoiT has a specialization in that. We are there for the same reason. We are not there to just lift and shift people from one place to another.
Coming back to your question, Sam, I think there's no correct answer to this, no yes or no, because it depends is the answer on this. Depends what you want to migrate. If you have, I don't know, 500 servers, 10 business units, you always want to go for a lift, shift, and modernize afterwards, but don't forget it, because migrating this on the way will be a huge overhead. You would need to have an knowledgeable people in each department guiding them, supporting them. This will take years for the whole migration to do. And not
if I
work,
remember
but
properly, the migration framework from AWS actually says that if you need to do it in a hurry, move it first and then, first is rehost and then re-architect. Yeah.
it's even stated like assess, mobilize, and then migrate and modernize. So it's typically that you do the modernization at the end. Most people forget this step for some reason. Let's assume you have a SaaS application or an application you run, one single application which is quite huge somewhere on a data center or so. You could apply patterns to move one service after another to the cloud if it makes financially sense. So the traffic and the latency and so on is okay for you. Then it would be a good way or good fit for a modernization during the migration. Let's assume the strangler figure pattern where you say, okay, we move this API or this resource to the cloud, and then the next one, and by this you close or shut down service by service.
I want to move into Mobilize and
We are already in Mobilize.
well, I want to move into tagging within Mobilize. I realized we made kind of like a non-defined switch. So, I wanted to talk about tagging because, you know, the the MAP program isn't all about funding. It's more, like you said, it's more about a framework for going about migrations. But the funding is a key part for people, for companies that are taking advantage of it. But you don't get it if you don't tag your resources. You don't get any of it. And how often is the case? Maybe it's, I don't think it's with us, but customers forgetting to tag or doing it incorrectly. How easy it is to do the tagging incorrectly.
Let's say your funding is approved. How will AWS know if you, let's say you have submitted $1 million map, the AWS approved your funding? How will AWS know if that much ARR is generated in your account? Anybody can just submit $1 million map and get funding approved. But there is a strategy AWS has in the backend where they monitor this spend throughout the migration process. And for that, the backend thing to, for AWS to monitor that spend, there is this tagging process that comes into picture. Tagging process is very easy. People think like there are like 10, 20 different tags they have to apply to their all resources. No, that is not the case. There is only one tag that needs to be applied to all the resources that are attached to this whole migration process. We do it when the customer completes their access and it is approved. We provide them a good training session, and it is just one tag. It is not super rocket science. Like, you don't have to do anything. And there is this service known as tag editor in AWS. You can easily apply that tag to all the resources involved in this map. So that is, but that is why we mentioned you need project managers in place where they can also make sure from the customer side, because even if a partner is involved, they don't have visibility in their, most of the time. If it is DoiT, we do not have any visibility in what is going on into your AWS, because we do not have any admin access or anything there. But if you, what we tell them is every month we should have a sync session and see if the tags are getting applied correctly. So that is one strategy DoiT provide. But if a partner is not involved, you definitely have to do every month, like check every month, like all the resources are tagged with that unique tag that AWS provides you once the map funding is approved for that. Without that, if you will not reach the threshold, and AWS will not release the fund. AWS is not going to release all the funds in one go. They are going to release the fund based on what threshold your ARR is at certain point, and then only you will get the funds for that map process.
It's not only limited to the funding itself, it's also for the credits you get, because they are based on growth. So that for them, it's also quite important. I think the pity is you don't know what you missed because you have missed it and you don't have a simple overview about it. Because the tags are typically only used for the map relevant resources, but if you had something before in your account, it's not valid for the map. So seeing the invisible is a big problem here. And also it can get complicated if you're not doing a classic lift and shift, because then it's quite easy to apply everything. But when you have that's more modern serverless application stack, for example, and you have many resources with queues, with lambdas, maybe event bridge, DynamoDB, maybe multiple tables and other things. So then can get complicated to tag all of these resources. Some are also not taggable. That's another story. Then you need to submit it manually. And then if you have, for example, developers who are working on this infrastructure, they need to apply the tag, for example, automatically during the writing of CloudFormation, CDK, Terraform, other steps, or you can enforce this. Also, there's other issues there. So as more complex as your architecture goes, as more complex the tagging goes. And the last one is there's a second tag which is existing if you're eligible for extra credits for your database services. If you migrate to certain database services, you get 10% extra. Then you need to add this as well.
What about with when you're making the landing zone? So I assume that this is where, like you said earlier, this is where you're creating the landing zones. Anything go wrong with that? I mean, if it's based on bad capacity planning, or do people over-engineer it, for instance? Maybe it should be more of a POC type thing and not something that's full scale.
So landing zone definitely is basically like your networking setup in AWS account, and network needs bandwidth calculation and capacity correctly. If you don't, if the customer does not provide the correct bandwidth needed, uh, correct bandwidth needed for this whole application, and if the landing zone is not able to support it, it becomes little bit problematic to change the once the landing zone is set. It becomes problematic to again change the landing zones in the back. If like Fabian has anything more to add to that.
Oh, I would have to add a lot there, but let's try to keep it short or efficient.
I think one of the challenges that I've seen, and it's not specific to MAP, but with landing zones in particular, is customers just say, "Oh, look, Amazon's got a new product, let's deploy it," without understanding what it is. And in the case of the original landing zone, I haven't looked at it, the latest updates, but it would deploy in multiple regions with multiple NAT gateways and just start running up costs that you didn't expect. So I think, as with anything cloud, it's really important to understand what you're deploying before you do it and make sure you're willing to pay for the things you're deploying.
And also deploying the right solution from your current and your future needs. Because as Piyush said, changing some of the things in the landing zone can be impossible or a huge effort. If you have, for example, a shared network and you deploy all of the networks automatically, or you don't do it, but you want to switch to it afterwards, you have hundreds of accounts with VPCs on their own, and you need to shift from there to a centrally organized network. So determine the needs and planning for the future is one of the huge mistakes. Many have just deployed the big bang towards their environment, and they paid for ages for it and haven't used a small portion of it. Or the other way around, we have started with a single account, and then you need to split all of this.
Now, thinking about those, especially that are coming from on-prem, they're probably using, in some cases at least, they're probably using some software that's outdated, old, fit for on-prem, and maybe it's hard to move over to the cloud. What are those situations like, or like what can customers do better with that?
From my point of view, there are two things. One is wrong expectations for this. So some people or some companies have the expectation, if we move our old slow application to the cloud, we can make it faster. And then are disappointed by it's not being faster, which is not a big surprise. And the other one is that you still need to modernize it when you move it to the cloud. So maybe you can't run your application on the newest Windows server, or whatever, because it's supported, because it was running on Windows 2003 on-premise. And you need to find a way to make it run, make it migrated, or another solution.
Run times are very much important. Let's say I had seen a customer whole map got submitted, and the customer was running Python 2.7, and the node version was 16. So AWS has definitely deprecated the versions for both, and it was little bit like it was little bit trouble to recalculate the whole stuff. How much then there is no any other way to do that other than modernizing, because AWS does not let you launch services. Those are going to support those versions. So there is going to be some kind of modernization needed at that point. And why that mistake happened was when they started the map phase. At that time, both of the versions were supported, so nobody cared. Like, oh, okay, this is. But they did not take a look. Like AWS gave a notice at certain. I don't remember the date, but at this date they are going to deprecate both the versions. So and the map project started after the deprecation. So that's why they came into trouble. Like, okay, we did not anticipated this, and now we want to first modernize in our own on-premise center and then migrate it to AWS. So they wanted to launch some Lambda functions using Node, but they were not able to do that because their whole application was using some Node 14 or something, and current version supported by Lambda is like Node 18 plus. So you can get. So that was not their mistake. Also, we cannot say it was their mistake, but we have to take cloud, like what is going to deprecate when. We have to take a look into that also, based on how much this project is going to how much time this project is going to take.
Before we move into, unless we've already moved into Migrate, but before we move into it, is there anything else you want to cover on Mobilize? Things to look out for, where expectation doesn't meet reality, and like that.
one thing I would want to add, like nowadays there are these migrations for Gen AI happening a lot, and for some reason, AWS TCO calculator that everybody use, it only calculates when you are using AWS Titan, which is the native to AWS. There is no any other. If you want to use some bedrock with Claude AI or something, there is no way you can calculate the cost incurred by that. So in that thing, AWS needs to your AWS account manager needs to intervene and get the calculation, and there you will need some manual intervention at that point, because the TCO for any map, a TCO calculator link needs to be submitted for the approval. So those calculations will be not there, and then AWS account manager needs to submit those manually by doing like this is how much. So you need to make sure those calculations are always part of your whole map process. Or if you don't, many customers, if so we are completing one map currently where the customer is migrating to Claude, and they thought the like they did not find Claude calculation in TCO calculator, so they just skipped it. But that was like $300,000 less as compared to their ARR they calculated for the map. So the AWS account manager was good, and he mentioned to them, okay, we will have to do manual calculation and submit it, so that you don't get less funding as compared to what you are. And I don't know when AWS is going to do up like let us calculate all the models, but as of today, the limitation is you can only calculate Titan calculation. No other model calculations are allowed in TCO.
And the pricing calculator is the unwanted child of AWS. It's not well maintained. I hope I can say this here publicly, but I stand to this. Has many services missing in the AWS in the calculator. But in the past, they accepted, for example, placeholder EC2 instances. So you would have needed to add EC2 instances for 300, whatever K the value is, and this was accepted in the past. From my point of view, another well-made mistake in the Mobilize phase is everything sounds amazing on the paper. You have done your homework, you wrote down everything, you have read everything, you had a partner involved, and then moving forward to the Migrate and Modernize phase without validating it. So just assuming it is working is most of the time not working. So you need to test it by shifting the most critical or the less critical application towards the cloud or the most urgent one, and then see is the migration itself working, is the operating of all of this working, the monitoring, the security, also testing all of the functions you deployed. If your security alarming is working, for example, or you just think you are safe, but you are not safe. So quite important part of it, testing and validating.
Onto Migrate, and I think this was mentioned briefly before, but I think it was that customers or companies will migrate and then they won't optimize after they migrate or continue modernizing. They just think that once you're migrated, okay, it's as good as it can be, and we're done here. We're on the cloud. High five. That's it. Where am I going with this? Is is why do you think is that the mentality? Is that the expectation that, hey, we're here, this is as cheap as it's going to be, and that's it?
Why I had seen that happening is because the customer forgets to calculate the development hour needed for modernization also after the migration is done. Let's say you do a lift and shift, and when you need to migrate, there are going to be certain investment that the company needs to do, and they say, oh, okay, we can just keep it running like this. We don't want to invest more money. But that is the mistake, because anyway, if you save that money, you are going to pay the money for the infrastructure if it is not like if it is not modernized to run on public cloud.
It's also quite often driven, or someone driving this is also quite often missing, because you need an internal stakeholder for this. The innovation and all of this, the transformation can't come from the outside. We can support from the outside, we can give tips, we can guide, we can enable, but you really need to want to do it as a company, because you need to buy in from all stakeholders, someone who's advocating for this. It highly depends on the company structure and the software they're running. Especially that there are many other impacts on this. And I would also say it's not only limited to migration, but migrations, it has the biggest impact, because you always need to continuously think about how can we innovate, how can we update our infrastructure to the latest tech updates. And in the migration, it has the biggest impact on the successful outcome or field outcome of the migration.
I think you hit on a key spot though, Piyush, as well, when you said people don't budget for it, because I think everyone has the best will in the world when it comes to these things. But companies have priorities, devs have a backlog of tasks they're meant to be achieving, and sometimes making a working system work is not necessarily, the highest priority. So companies, if they want to experience the full benefits, need to start looking at what else can I do beside just running this on an EC2.
After the like, I guess I don't know if it's after or during the migration, but no, it's actually after the migration. Can there be situations where you're testing things out in the landing zone and in the Mobilize phase, everything works great, and then you're still seeing application performance problems when post migration still for some reason? And is there any way to detect detect that ahead of time, or you just have to see it after you migrate, see if there's an issue?
So one latency issue that I have come across is a customer was US based. They did not have any latency issue, and after like migration was done, their product went global. And when the people from other part of world tried to access their product, they came into huge latency issues, and they needed to launch their product into let's say EMEA or Europe. So that kind of latency issues we have seen after the migration happening. That is one case that might happen with the customer.
But was that a case of like maybe business stakeholders weren't involved in the planning because they might have been able to say, hey, but aren't we going to be expanding globally around the same time that we're supposed to complete the migration?
In this specific case, the customer got bought out by another company, which was like in Europe, and they started providing their product in that part also, but their complete infrastructure was in US. So they had to that I don't know. We mentioned to them, ask AWS if that qualifies for a migration because they are launching the whole stack into a new part of the world. But I did not hear anything after that. But that was one issue that I had seen, like latency issues happening, and that was not a mistake from customer side not to calculate, but they did not anticipate after like 1.5 years that company is going to get bought out by another like another company which is outside USA.
What also goes into the latency part, or probably problems during migration, is that you maybe tested it out with shifting one of your workloads towards the cloud and maybe also migrating another workload during the testing. But if you start migrating heavily and maybe you're still using a hybrid approach for some applications, your connection between your data center or your office space or both of them to the cloud could get chunked up. And then maybe all of the applications face some latency issues or the transfer is getting slower. And but this also your migration can take longer because when the bandwidth is slower, migrating all of your data takes longer. So it has a huge impact. Everybody has latency issues there maybe. So calculating for the whole bandwidth and capacity you need during the migration is important.
And one part we all forgot, like there should be a proper DR planning involved in this project. There should be a failover region at any point, no matter if your application is robust. Things might go wrong from the AWS side also. There might be outage in that, so you should definitely have a robust DR failover strategy in some other region so that you don't face this kind of downtimes, because those
And a
things are out of
rollback plan for
exactly
your migration.
exactly and those things are not in your control because anything can happen with a data center. So you need a proper DR planning, and that should also be a part of your whole TCO calculation. Because because DR is also going to involve price, because you are launching any strategy, any DR strategy you use, you are going to launch certain resources in other regions. So those are going to incur cost. So that should also be a part of your calculation.
Anything else in the migrate? Otherwise, because otherwise I would just maybe rapid fire. What are your best practices? I can already think of some. Just thinking of some of the key points you've emphasized over and over, like the project manager, uh, getting stakeholder buy-in, etc. But anything else in migrate? Otherwise, Fabian, Piyush, I'd love to hear from your just a best practices summary.
Best practice summary is like more involvement in access phase is needed, and the application should always be in line with well architected framework provided by AWS. So that is one main best practice. I tell customers, like if you miss anything in that, you might come into trouble Not from funding side. Like, forget about funding. You might come into trouble with your application in future if you don't cover all the 6 pillars mentioned by AWS. So that is one best practice I mentioned to the customer. Follow the well architected framework by AWS, because that is in place for optimal performance of your application, and you should not skip any of those just because it is going to cost you a little bit more. That little cost might get shadowed if there is outage in your whole application. So uh, follow those are one best practices done, and involve correct cloud architect or the solution architect, uh, because the cloud skill set is totally different from let's say an on-premise skill set needed for this migration.
Yes, absolutely. Let me try to put this into something short. There's one person I'd like to hear where they ask to say one sentence only about it, because I probably could talk ages about the best practices. Probably the best one is that you should try to not get overwhelmed by all of the information you find, because there's plenty of documentation available, plenty of guides. In particular from AWS, they have released so many guidance and so on. And if you start digging deep into them, also as a customer, you can get quite fast lost in all of the information, all of the overwhelming stuff, and then could fail, because parts of it are really amazing, parts of it are not so amazing. So you should have somebody by hand who has done the mistakes for you already. And then probably plan for the unpredictable. Everything will, I think, but most of the stuff will be different in execution than in reality.
So I think you've basically covered how I was going to wrap things up anyway there. And that is, exactly as you said, it's a huge subject and a huge topic, and there's no way we can do it justice in whatever we got here, 45 minutes in a podcast. So if you are looking to map, get in touch with a partner like ourselves. There are plenty of partners out there. Check out the APN from Amazon. Make sure you overinvest in the assess phase, as Pierre said. Get that TCO right, get your architectures right, and talk to someone who's got experience with it. One of the other things I want to really quickly mention is there are actually hundreds of funding programs available in AWS. MAP is only one of few, and lots of ways to get a bit more. So do ask your account managers about it too. Gentlemen, I think we'd better call it there. Thank you very much. Matan seems to be having a bit of internet trouble, so I'm going to sign off for us. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us the rundown through the Migration Acceleration Program. And we will see you all in the next podcast.
Thank you.